Again, I'm very grateful for being here and having the opportunity to speak to our friends and colleagues and comrades and sisters and brothers. The introduction, actually, I think, is something that we should be thinking about in the sense that talking about a visit, having the audio recording of a speaker speaking about his visit to the Soviet Union and China uh, sort of fits in with the discussion that we're having today, in that Iran, or the Islamic Republic of Iran, is a country that is not understood well at all in the United States. In fact, because of the sheer power of Western media, American media in particular, it is not well understood anywhere in the world, I think, except for some areas which have a close relationship with the country and where people see through the propaganda. In fact, over the years, as I've been working with media and with academics to try to create a different uh, environment for understanding Iran, I met two very good and decent friends, Flint Leverett and Hillary Mann Leverett, husband and wife, who worked in the White House. And Flint resigned over the Iraq War in 2003. And we um, began to have a friendship, and we met one another, and they visited Iran 3 times. And ultimately, they wrote a book on Iran called Going to Tehran. And because of the different view of Iran that they held, or the view that they held a after years of coming and going, uh, they were sidelined and they were marginalized. So as their views about Iran evolved, they became more marginalized within the American political establishment, and ultimately they were expelled in a sense. And even though they had worked in a very high ranking government officials, they are ignored simply because their views on Iran evolved. And actually, I would advise people to read their book, Going to Tehran, even though it was written about a decade ago. And I don't necessarily agree with everything in the book, but I think it's a very good book to read. But the point is that visiting, I'm sure, the Soviet Union back then, and or visiting China back then came at a price. And nowadays, I think visiting Russia and China may also have a price. You may also have to pay a price as well. But I think visiting Iran is something that we should be seeing more often by friends and colleagues and people who are interested in politics, so that they could see through the propaganda and to understand the world in a different way. The problem, I think, that the United States has more than anything else is that it defines the world. It tries to impose that definition, or it tries to have the rest of the world accept that definition. And then it carries out policies like against different countries or towards different countries based on those definitions, based on those narratives, based on often propaganda. So they believe their own propaganda, and they fail in their policies. I would assume we could say that's the case in Latin America or across Africa, but without a doubt, when it comes to the Islamic Republic of Iran, when it comes to West Asia, uh, this has led to many failures in the United States. Uh, but the problem, of course, in the United States is there is no accountability. The people who carry out failed policies they are not punished. They are not marginalized. They are not ignored. They continue to be the go-to people for future uh, policy decision decisions. They're the people who the politicians in the United States and the political leaders or the military leaders speak to when they want to think about uh, pursuing a course of action in our part of the world. And I think the same is true with Russia and China in particular. So since there's no accountability, we see no change. And the same narratives are repeated over and over again for decades. And the people who produce those narratives are well paid. They teach at good universities. They work in think tanks and receive very good salaries. And they hire so-called Iranians who repeat what needs to be said. In other words, they repeat the narrative, the accepted narrative in Washington. And if anyone says anything that goes counter to those narratives, well, then they are a mouthpiece of a dying regime. They are a mouthpiece of a dictatorship, a corrupt dictatorship, a dictatorship that's falling apart, that's incapable of governing itself, that is brutal towards women, that hates freedom, and so on. But the problem, of course, with these narratives is that since they're based on a great deal of Orientalism, on an Orientalist tradition, and there's a great deal of anger and hostility mixed with this, these narratives have a large degree of contradictions within them, but they go unnoticed. The same evil and ugly regime that is hated and despised by its own people is also a growing threat, is also a threat to the region, if not the world, which would seem to be paradoxical. It would seem to be impossible to be both corrupt and collapsing, but also a rising threat simultaneously. But when it comes to Iran, you can have they can have their cake and they can eat it too. I think the best way to understand the Islamic Republic of Iran is first to recognize that Iran is a normal country, like other countries across the world. When you enter the country, you will see people walking down the streets, people driving in their cars, going to work, going home, going shopping, visiting people, just like anywhere else. In Iran, you'll see women taxi drivers, you'll see women scientists. At university, you'll see women professors being hired in large numbers. You will see that the majority of students are women. You'll see women in high-ranking positions, but also you'll see women working in factories. You'll see women pilots, but you'll also see women housewives. It is a country that is not different from the countries that the United States usually glorifies or supports or has been supporting traditionally. In fact, I would argue that in order to counter Iran, in order to weaken Iran, the United States and its allies have created an Islam, an American Islam, which is despotic. They have empowered a type of Islam that is brutal, such as ISIS, such as Al Qaeda, such as many of the extremist movements that we've seen in Afghanistan or Libya, and such as the governments in the Persian Gulf that have been funding these extremist groups, such as in Qatar, in particular over the last couple of decades, but Saudi Arabia has been doing so as well for decades. The Saudis, ironically, under Mohammed bin Salman, have been distancing themselves from many of these movements, while Qatar, which is a close ally of the United States and where CENTCOM is based, is funding them. And today we see that the head of the Al Qaeda in Syria was meeting the ruler of Qatar in Damascus. So, in order to counter the revolution and also the Soviet Union, the United States began funding extremism. We saw that in Afghanistan when Brzezinski and Carter funded Afghan jihadists or mujahideen, as they called it, in order to encourage the Soviet Union to invade the country. They didn't begin it after the invasion. They did this before the invasion. They wanted to create a Vietnam for the Soviet Union. In other words, they were sacrificing a country because of their own geopolitical rivalry with the Soviet Union. And then after that, they used the same tools of extremism, Wahhabism and Salafism and Takfiri ideology against Iran. So the same people who prevent women from going to school, the same people who behead innocent civilians in Iraq, in Syria, and elsewhere, these same people were supported by the United States, its European allies, the Israeli regime, of course, NATO, and of course their regional partners, whether it's in Ankara or in the Persian Gulf or in Amman, Jordan. So the same groups that carry out these atrocities are allies of the United States, yet the United States attributes this sort of behavior to Iran. And that, I think, is something that is a major challenge for the Islamic Republic of Iran and its friends and allies across the world, because Iran does not have much of a voice. It does not have a media. Of course, Iran has media, but it's all been sanctioned. So people in the West cannot watch or use Iranian media or access Iranian media easily because of the sanctions. And therefore, it continues to be a challenge for Iranians to get through and to reach a broader audience. But I do think something has changed, and that is Gaza. The genocide in Gaza has changed the views of many people across the world. Because whatever you may think about the Islamic Republic of Iran, it has been the only country that was defending the people of Gaza by supporting the resistance, continuing to support the resistance. How they do it, God knows. The resistance in Gaza, the resistance in the West Bank, and of course, supporting the axis of resistance. Despite experiencing suffering through maximum pressure sanctions, it continues to aid and assist a resistance from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean, which has been fighting to put an end to the genocide. So we had the Islamic Republic of Iran and the so-called, or the axis of resistance on the one side, and we had Western powers and their regional partners on the other side. Even countries like Turkey, the government was assisting the Israeli regime throughout the genocide by sending it oil, cheap oil from Baku. The Emirates, Jordan, and Egypt all were doing business with the regime. So while the West, the collective West, was supporting the Israeli regime, and regional countries were assisting the regime, and countries across the world were at most indifferent, the Islamic Republic of Iran was paying a price to fight against the genocide and to support the Palestinian people. And that has created a change across the world, the change that I have noticed. As the months went on, more people began to wonder whether Iran is really all that evil and bad if it is the only country that is paying a price to support the axis of resistance. When I say the only country, of course, Yemen, the government of Yemen, is just as significant, and it is paying just a heavy price, if not a much heavier price, than the Islamic Republic of Iran. But unfortunately, the government of Yemen is not considered to be the the government of the country by the so-called international community, and that is for political reasons. It is because the government in Yemen is not a government that has been acceptable to Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and other family regimes in the region, and therefore the West and others in the UN Security Council have made sure that the government of Yemen is not internationally recognized. But in any case, the axis of resistance has continued to support the Palestinian people and the Palestinian cause. And that has created I can say with confidence, a sea change. It hasn't turned things around completely, but it has raised questions among many people with regards to the narratives of Iran and the narratives around Iran and the resistance. I think it's best for me to stop here because the questions that our colleagues and comrades and brothers and sisters raise, I think, would be more interesting than anything that I could say by continuing this talk.
Thank you very much, Professor, for those eloquent and important remarks. And we look forward to the Q&A